Welcome to the next of our Building Equitable Economies webinar series. For the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about a crucial issue for California, which is forest resiliency, and really featuring some of the fantastic projects that are happening. Just a little bit of housekeeping, webinars being recorded. Please do keep your mics muted. You have access to the questions panel on the right side of your screen, and the webinar hopefully will conclude with decent amount of time for a Q&A segment. So you can both introduce yourself and ask those questions in the question and answer panel on the right. Okay, so I'm really pleased to have Jennee Kuang here with me. She is a program fellow in the environment at the HEWLETT Foundation. I'm going to introduce her a little bit more in just a second. And I'm Micah, CEO of California Forward. Got a couple of slides about what we're doing here, and then I will hand it over to Jennee. All right, so what is this Building Equitable Economies thing all about? Well, at California Forward, we really try to create an ecosystem of equity that allows us not only to take a look at the evidence through our California Dream Index, not only ground ourselves in the priorities of communities through the leadership of the members of our California Stewardship Network that stretches from the Redwood Coast to Imperial Valley, not only advance those policies through the work that we do with so many of you on the line, through the California Economic Summit, but also carry forward into law or better implementation a lot of those policies through California Forward and our California Forward Action Fund. So talking about wildfire today, obviously the state saw some pretty historic wildfires over the course of the past year, especially last year, and we're looking to do something about that. And we really, in everything that we do, ground ourselves in the data of what's going on, whether it's racial equity, economic growth, or in this case, what's happening in the environment. And you can see that whether it was the Bay Area, the Central Coast, or the Shasta Cascades, and similar data would be in every part of the state, we saw a dramatic drop in the number of days with good air quality in several California regions. And I think the key thing here is that fire is not something that's happening somewhere else in California. Fire and its implications, whether it's air quality or water quality, or impact on energy prices, or impact on our workforce, impact on our people, impact on environmental justice, it's really something that unites, unfortunately, every part of the state, and that every part of the state really needs to work on together. Okay, so before Jennee tees up Patrick, our first presenter, I just wanted to welcome her for some remarks. She'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Jennee is a program fellow in the environment at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and she's done a lot of amazing work in this area, previously consulting for the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Oakland Fire Safe Council, and she worked on the US EPA's innovation team, among other things. So Jennee, let me turn it over to you to kick off and moderate our program for today. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks very much, Micah. So I'm just going to spend a couple minutes doing two things. One is to just explain why and how the HEWLETT Foundation came into the wildfire space, and the other is some pretty basic reflections on wildfire in the Western United States that will not be news to any of you who have been working in this space. So I developed and manage a new grant-making strategy for the HEWLETT Foundation on wildfire resilience in the Western United States. It's a pretty small experimental folio for HEWLETT that's allowing us to explore the space for the first time. And we've recognized in creating the strategy that we absolutely need a future with fire resilient landscapes and fire resilient communities in the West, and that the two are very much interconnected. And I actually grew up in a chaparral ecosystem in a suburb of Southern California, and my family home was and still is located just within the boundary of a very high fire hazard severity zone. And as a kid, my family and I lived through a couple intense fire seasons. At the time, I really didn't think about the cause. Those fires felt like random natural disasters that were very much outside of our control. And what I didn't realize at the time is that several human-driven factors, including a historical paradigm of fire suppression on our Western landscapes, development of homes in high fire risk areas, and climate change were all exacerbating the destructive nature of these fires. Today, even though wildfires have become markedly more prevalent and extreme than in my childhood throughout California and throughout the West, I actually feel more optimistic, and that's because I now understand that if we invest in the right people and the right solutions, we can change this trajectory. Our speakers today are a subset of those right people, and they are working on a subset of those right solutions. I don't think it's a surprise to any of us at this point, especially after the increasingly informed news coverage from the 2020 wildfire season, that much of the West is composed of fire-adapted and fire-dependent landscapes. This means that wildfire will, and in many cases should, be a part of our Western reality. To become wildfire resilient, we must acknowledge and embrace this and reimagine our cultural, physical, and economic infrastructures accordingly. And while we do need fire on the landscape, what we don't want are the catastrophic fires that have been devastating communities and disrupting forest health. Where we landed with HEWLETT's strategy is on using our relatively limited dollars by focusing on policy advocacy, all in an effort to create better policy and regulatory environments and leverage additional public and private funding for sustained wildfire resilience work. California is one of the geographies in which HEWLETT is funding, and we're also funding in Washington State, Montana, Colorado, and at the federal level. And we're focusing on 4 areas within wildfire resilience, including prescribed burning, elevating tribal leadership, land use planning for community resilience, and increased funding. HEWLETT's wildfire strategy, the core of it is really centered around more diverse coalition building that is inclusive of and also beyond the traditional wildfire community, and we see that as critical to moving toward wildfire resilience. This includes elevating the voices of on-the-ground practitioners for policy advocacy. So thanks to Deb, Micah, and their colleagues at California Forward for the work they've been doing on this. They've been really important partners for HEWLETT in their efforts to convene a diverse set of stakeholders around forest management and wildfire resilience. And I'll end with just saying that good wildfire policy design and implementation must be informed by and will be carried out by our practitioners. So I'm very excited to hear from our speakers today. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Micah. So what I'm going to try to do, I'm Patrick Wright. I'm the director of the California Forest Management Task Force. I'm going to try to spend just a few minutes giving an overview of where the state of California is. When I took over the job as the task force director last summer, it was at a very interesting time for 2 reasons. One is the Forest Management Task Force, which is a large coalition of agencies and stakeholders, have been meeting for a couple of years trying to get a better handle on forest health and community resilience, and we're on the verge of presenting a set of recommendations. But at the same time, as many of you know, we were in the middle of, arguably at least the largest fire season in the state's history. As I started the job, or shortly thereafter, 5 of the 6 largest fires in the state's history were burning at the same time. So needless to say, there was a lot of attention and a lot of urgency to try to pull together the recommendations of the various task force work groups, but at the same time recognize that there's a lot of other great ideas that have been out there, large sets of recommendations from groups like PPIC, Little Hoover, LAO, California Forward itself had a comprehensive set of recommendations. And the overwhelming sentiment of those recommendations was the agencies are all working in silos. We know there's a lot going on, but we need it all pulled together. We need to better understand where the state's heading, what the different agencies are doing, how they're coordinating with the feds and locals. And secondly, we really need to be more action oriented. We're up to our ears in recommendations. It's time to really move forcefully together with an action-oriented plan. So I pulled together the work groups with some administration senior people and collaboratively worked on the development of what we're now calling a Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan, which was released in January together with the governor's proposed $1 billion budget to help back it up. It has nearly 100 specific action items on forest health, on community resilience, across the board to try to move the state, feds, and local agencies collectively together. Generally, I'm not going to go into the detail, but there's generally 4 major elements. One is on forest health, again, to try to, as we say, increase the pace and scale of forest health to try to get to 1 million acres treated between the state and the feds every year by 2025. To try to increasingly use regional frameworks and collaboratives, including the 2 that you'll hear from today, to try to get there. Second, to give a lot more emphasis to creating wildfire adapted communities, more money, more support for home hardening, defensible space, fuel breaks, and community-wide strategies. Third, we really need to link these strategies while we're moving with the state's carbon storage, climate adaptation, and biodiversity plans. Many of you heard of the 30 by 30 initiative that's been launched by the governor to protect 30% of the state. And of course, ARB's efforts to develop a climate change scoping plan and that includes the forest sector is also moving forward. So it's going to be a lot of emphasis on linking what's happening in the forest space with what's happening with the state's climate and biodiversity strategies. And finally, we really want to get a handle on all the new promising data and technologies that's out there. One of the biggest challenges we're facing is that at the same time that we're trying to increase pace and scale across the board, a lot of our local collaboratives are really struggling with how to get their stakeholders on board, what tools to use. So we're trying very hard to give regional and local frameworks the tools they need to increase their level of work. So overall, what I would say is there's generally 5 major themes moving ahead that dovetails into what you're going to hear from our regional speakers. One, as Jennee said, we've got to link the health of our forest and the safety of our communities. When the task force was started, candidly, it was a forest management task force. It wasn't focused so much on community safety, but with the increase in fires and the increase in the need for coordination, it's become more and more evident that we need to start pulling together joint strategies that link forest health and community resilience. Second, we've also got to recognize that environmental health and economic health are linked. They're not at war with each other as they might have been previously under the timber wars. We've got to find ways, particularly in the Sierra Nevada, to link our forest health projects with the economic health of our rural communities in California. Third, and you'll hear a lot more about this from our speakers, we've got to get more fire on the ground. And I know that sounds counterintuitive to the public. Hey, we just had 4 million acres of the state burned. Why do we need more fire? Well, the answer, of course, is we need more low-intensity fire, because low-intensity prescribed fire is vital to protect the state's biodiversity, to provide all sorts of environmental benefits, and equally important, to prevent the kind of mega fires that we're getting that have occurred largely because of the absence of prescribed fire over the last several decades. Fourth, we need to increasingly work at all levels. Again, I'd be the first to say traditionally, the state's been working in their silo, the feds have been working in theirs. We're now partnering all across the board between the state agencies, the federal agencies, and the local agencies, recognizing that fire resiliency and forest health crosses agency boundaries and ownerships. And if we're going to scale up, we've got to get all those interests together at the table. And then finally, and probably most important, we've got to more aggressively support and promote regional frameworks. We've got to move beyond the state of California giving top-down grants to individual projects to sustainable investments in regional collaboratives like the ones you're going to hear from today. Those regional collaboratives have a much better handle than the state does on what are the local risks, what are the local priorities. And those are going to differ between the North Coast, the Sierra Nevada, the South Coast, the Central Coast. So the idea is over time to transition the state support and funding and federal support and funding to support regional collaboratives that can assess the health of their landscape, prioritize projects, bring the community together, tie their work to local economic health and community health so that we can move forward together in an integrated fashion. And what we're going to hear from our speakers today is exactly how 2 areas in the state are attempting to do that. But I want to assure you that they're not operating in a vacuum. The state and federal agencies are working very hard to align our resources to the maximum extent possible to support the kind of efforts that you're going to hear from now. So I hope that gives you at least a little bit of an overview of some of the themes of where the state and federal agencies are going. You can certainly go on the task force website to get a copy of the plan and the proposed budget. But more importantly, I encourage you to get engaged at the local level with the kind of collaboratives that you're going to hear from today. So thank you very much for this short overview. And with that, I assume I'm turning it over to Will.
Greetings, my name is Will Harling. I'm the director of the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council, and I'm coming to you from the Western Klamath Mountains in far Northwest California, and speaking to you about the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership that formed here in 2013 to restore fire process on our 1.2 million acres along the Klamath River in the Western Klamath Mountains. I'm born and raised here, originally got into fire kind of by the back door of trying to save our spring Chinook salmon runs. And, you know, realizing that if we didn't solve our fire problem in California, we weren't going to solve a host of other social and ecological problems. I'm also very fortunate to have been lifelong friends with Bill Tripp with the Kuduk tribe, who's a leader in fire management, both you know, regionally in the state and nationally, as well as other folks like Margot Robbins. This is our visit to Kim Pimlott several years ago, you know, trying to align state and tribal goals with fire management. Really what we're talking about here is, you know, creating a social and cultural movement to change how we manage fire in California. I just briefly wanted to give you a few visuals of how far departed we are from historic landscapes that were shaped by fire. On the left, you see Red Cap Glade in 1944, where local Kuduk folks would gather bodea bulbs. You know, that glade doesn't exist today. Similarly, looking upriver from Big Rock in Orleans on the right, you can see the skylines with trees, you know, how sparse those forests were, you know, 40 to 60% canopy closure. You know, fast forward to today and it's 80 to 100% canopy closure, where the conifers have filled in all of those open grasslands and woodlands. Now, looking back into history, we see these patterns of indigenous burning along ridges, along trails, using recent fire footprints as boundaries instead of fire lines and fuel breaks. And in essence, you know, this way of managing is the only proven way of managing fire in California and worked for, you know, at least the last 10,000 years. And importantly, this management isn't a thing of the past. There's still tribal people all over California that are waiting to have their rights to manage fire on their landscape and to produce the resources that come from that management, you know, waiting for those laws to change. And the cost that we've paid for choosing fire suppression as our primary management strategy for fire is deep. On the right, you see the watershed above my home on the North Fork of the Salmon River that burned in 1987 after being helicopter logged with no slash cleanup. We lost over 5 feet of topsoil that went down in the river and drove the temperatures up to where the salmon started dying. On the left is Godfrey Ranch, where my friend Karuna lost her second home to wildfire in the 87 fires. So my goal today is to peel back the layers of this onion that goes deep in less than 15 minutes. So it's a big lift. So bear with me. Many slides, lots of information, and hopefully this is just the start of a conversation. This map you see on the left, I think, is a valuable, it's like the Rosetta Stone for understanding fire on our landscapes. And what it is the number of overlapping fires. So all that purple color you see hasn't seen any fire in over 100 years. And the most fire overlaps we've had is 5 in, you know, less than 1% of our 1.2 million acre landscape. So, you know, we haven't seen this amount of fuel on our landscape since the last ice age. And had we not chosen fire exclusion, we would see places on average that had 30 fire overlaps in the last 100 years. So just imagine, you know, what that might look like. And you know, the reality is that, you know, we need to restore fire process in these recent fire footprints and start to safely get more fire back on the ground. Now, unfortunately, what we're seeing is this huge uptick in size and severity of wildfires. And the reality is that only recent fire footprints are stopping these mega fires. And so we went from a fire deficit in the early part of the last century to a fire glut with the high shift towards higher severity fire with severe environmental impacts. This is just one example from Grider Creek, where we had a thunderstorm, a summer thunderstorm after the previous season's wildfire, which basically, took out 20 miles of high quality coho habitat in one day. This is the scene that I saw coming into Happy Camp to fight the Slater Fire on Black Tuesday of last year when the West Coast burned. And the reality is that the fires of today are just so much more intense than anything we've seen in the past. This fire burned over 90,000 acres in a 24-hour period. Over 700 structures were lost. 3 folks died. You can see the wind direction there, 50-mile-an-hour wind with 3% humidity. No amount of fuel breaks, no amount of work away from homes is going to save our communities from fires like this. It's really whether or not you have good black on the ground. And by good black, I mean recent beneficial fire within an area significant enough to change the trajectory of these ember and wind-driven fire events. And you can see here, the 2 recent fires on the left of your screen are the only thing that stopped this fire from going all the way to the coast and burning down Crescent City in that initial period. So the interesting thing with the Slater Fire, you can see how it articulated with the 2018 Natchez fire footprint, and how that big wind pushed it into those recent fire footprints. So it's really how we use these recent fire footprints to avoid situations like this. My dear friend Dean Davis, lost his beautiful home that he had spent the last 50 years building and maintaining. He stayed and defended and almost lost his life. Unfortunately, our ability to work with our federal partners is limited at this point because, the lack of institutional willingness to engage with our local fire partners. And so we had proposed a cross-boundary burn upslope of their home, which is the direction the fire came in, for 5 years prior to this. And unfortunately, they were unwilling to engage us in that project. Luckily, the small 5-acre burn that we did do on Dean's property was enough for him to survive the event, just barely. But the landscape they're looking at today, their bench was one of the few things that survived, is going to be changed for the rest of their lives. Just another lesson learned from the Red Salmon Fire, which happened last year as well, just to the south. You can see how it burned into the 1999 Meagram Fire. So basically what we're seeing is that these recent fire footprints are only good for about 10 years at buffering those wildfires. And to the north, you see it's been stopped by the 2013 Butler Fire. And really, the interesting thing is that fire managers are really kind of using wildfires to bring fire back because there's no liability. I embedded with a hotshot crew and we burned 400 acres in a day with no permits, no smoke or air quality issues, no liability, brought fire down to the homes. It was basically a prescribed fire. But there's all of the barriers we have in prescribed fire don't really apply in the wildfire environment. And so I think a lot of fire managers are just using wildfires to manage fire, even though, as you see here, it's basically maximizing the negative effects of fire across the landscape because, we put out 98% of all the starts, but the 2% that do get away burn at the hottest, driest times of year and threaten communities and increase risk to firefighters. So on our landscape, we started the Fire Safe Council 20 years ago to restore historic fire regimes, this conversation between our local, tribal, state, and federal partners. Unfortunately, we had a failure with our first collaborative effort where, our local Forest Service partners thought collaboration meant, we listened to the tribe and other NGOs and then we go and do what we want. But, the reality is that collaboration means, everybody is in it together and nobody loses an arm or a leg in that process of going to work on the ground. So In 2013, with the help of the Nature Conservancy, we convened the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership to restore fire process on this 1.2 million acre landscape. As you can see, it's one of the things we have going for us is 98% of our landscape is owned by and managed by the Forest Service, and so it's just one land partner we have to deal with. We're surrounded by wilderness areas that give us the ability to manage fire at larger scales. And I think one of our biggest successes was coming together around not what we disagreed with, but our shared values. So those values are sustainable local economies, cultural and community vitality, fire adapted communities, restored fire regimes, resilient biodiverse forests, plants, animals, and fish, and a healthy river system. And key to this was engaging partners, not just at the local and regional levels, but also the state and federal levels. You need a chain of shared vision from your local landscape all the way to Washington to sustain funding and make this work. And luckily, there's a lot of collaboration and partnerships and networks out there already, from FireWise to fire adapted communities, fire safe councils, that are kind of reaching down into the grassroots level to help us to organize and to help restore fire process on all of our landscapes. So luckily, we've seen a transition through WKRP from conflict to collaboration. This project on the right was a ribbon cutting for a recent large-scale fuels reduction project funded by National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. One of the keys was allowing us to see our values displayed on our 1.2 million acres. And so this overlay assessment that we did, and I can share this this tool, basically put 24 different spatial layers that represented our shared values, from industry to environment to tribal to ecology and wildlife. And it helped us point to where each treatment would achieve multiple values at one time and help restore fire process on the landscape. So our first pilot project was the SOMAS Project, addressing 5,600 acres, tying in these mid-slope properties that hadn't seen fire in over 100 years down into the river to allow for managed wildfires in the Western Klamath Mountains. One of the keys to that was treating the private lands first so that we had the social license to go bigger. One of the things I'm most proud of with this project is that we fully analyzed the no action alternative, i.e., what does continued fire exclusion mean? Because that is technically the no action alternative. And we also combined traditional knowledge as a form of best available science, which helped us to move away from single species management. And we collaboratively developed prescriptions. We had collaborative interagency field crews doing the prep. And now, just yesterday, I was out there implementing with our Karuk tribe and Forest Service partners our first broadcast burn on 36 acres on T-Bar. So we're actually doing the work together as well as planning it. Underneath that is, these tiered agreements, which are so critical for us to be able to work together and play in the same playing field. So luckily, myself as a nonprofit director is co-employed with the Karuk tribe, who's tied into the federal incident qualifications for fire, which allows us all to play on the same playing field or burn on the same burning field. I think, going after getting good fire on the ground is a fool's errand. We've been, beating our head against the wall for about 20 years. And most recently, after having initial success with all of these obstacles you see on the lower left, liability insurance and insurance have really become a stumbling block for our work. So we're really looking to the California Insurance Commission to help us, build those public industry partnerships to help, provide insurance for groups like ours that have lost it in the last couple years. This is just an example of, collaborative burning, which we've done mostly through the prescribed fire training exchange model. For the past 7 years, we've implemented the Klamath River Treks. every year we have in between 50 to 100 participants. We have a lot of media that's helping tell the story. We work right in the WUI, right around homes, and we've built our trust with our CAL FIRE partners to the point of where, you know, pretty much every year we're putting fire on the ground, even during statewide burn suspensions, because we can show, you know, that we're going to do good with that fire. So, you know, this is just an example of the level of burning we do right around homes. And, you know, these are all the faces of the people that are touched by this good fire. So in the past 6-7 years, we've treated 2,300 acres on over 125 properties with more than 450 participants from all over the country and all over the world with no escape fires. One thing I want to touch on was telling our smoke story. You know, luckily we have a partnership with Lee Tarnay with the Forest Service, who's able to produce graphics like this that shows our local community what our prescribed fire smoke here on the lower right looks like compared to wildfires the same day, which are in the hazardous level for weeks or months. So building local resources is key to success. During COVID this last year, we weren't able to bring our Spaniards or other folks from across the nation, but because of these past training events, we had over 50 local federally qualified participants to help us get good fire on the ground. And this, you know, combination of resources it makes us stronger because we're all coming to fire from different angles, and we have a lot to teach each other. It's such a fertile environment for growth. So as far as increasing the use of prescribed fire in our neck of the woods, you know, supporting the Yurok and Cultural Fire Management Council, as well as the Karuk tribe with the Klamath Treks, we're currently creating these interagency mobile burn teams for Northern California through the all hands, all lands model. So networking with regional collaboratives to move our prescribed fire resources to where people have good burn windows. We're helping grow the prescribed burn associations throughout California that were pioneered in Humboldt to other counties like Siskiyou and to the south, as well as supporting cultural family-based burning. And this is just an example from where I live on the Salmon River of how, you know, we need those recent fire footprints around us to restore fire process. And so my biggest threat in the coming years is not getting fire into these recent fire footprints, because once we keep fire out for more than 10 years, it becomes an impact. So here you can see another project we're working on, the potential operational wildfire delineations, which is basically a tool for us to communicate between our federal land managers and fire managers with our communities about levels of shared risk and where we should put that funding to create that strategic network of fuel breaks to start to create the space for larger prescribed burning as well as manage wildfire. Another project we're working on is the reburn model, which allows us to model what it would look like had fire never been taken out of this ecosystem. And it really, you can look at, you know, what full suppression looks like on the vegetation outcomes, as well as what no suppression and even indigenous burning looks like, which is that middle bar on that's in red on the far right, you know. So having a shared vision for what we're managing towards is key towards success. So luckily WKRP was selected in Tier 1 for Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Act funding. We're hoping that gets fully funded this year so we can start to increase the investment to the scale we need to be working on. Start to create the social license for managed wildfire by having those fuel breaks in place, and ultimately restore cultural and ceremonial burning with the Karuk tribe and support our Forest Service partners to get prescribed fire done at larger scales. So yeah, I think I pretty much covered it all. I'm sure I'm over time, so I'm going to end it there.
Thank you, Will. And we'll go ahead and kick it over to Jonathan.
Wonderful job, Will. Thank you. For those listening, those viewing, Will, you said most of it, so I'm going to run through some slides. We're just going to take on a different geography, but the issues are really quite parallel, similar. So let me just launch into this. Here's what I'm going to focus on, the South Lassen Watershed Group. What you're looking at is Mount Lassen. We're talking about the Northern Sierra and the Southern Cascades. Next slide, please. And very, very briefly, what I'm going to cover, where, why, who, and what this group has taken on. We're moving into the 4th year, but it's really based on a 20-year collaborative effort, similar to what Will outlined. Next one, let me start with where the Sierra Institute is located. We're based in the Northern Sierra. The Sierra Institute for Community and Environment has been around for 25 years. We're a nonprofit organization, again, based in the Northern Sierra. We work locally, we work statewide. We also take on national issues, particularly focused on policy. It's work that we've enjoyed doing over time, but it is this work on the ground that is some of the most gratifying work that we do. And we are based in Indian Valley, that upper right-hand picture. I'm going to show you that barn again in just a moment. We're based in Taylorsville, and you can see Plumas County there in the Northern Sierra. This is the North Fork of the Feather River, or the Upper Feather River watershed. This is really significant. You're going to see that red arrow throughout to keep you oriented. The South Lassen Watershed Group actually focuses more to the north and west of this Lake Almanor area. It's the 8th largest reservoir in the state of California. You see a little teeny tiny yellow arrow there. That's Antelope Lake. And Antelope Lake is the headwaters, or the very top of the California State Water Project. The Almanor Reservoir is not officially part of the State Water Project, but it's critical, as I said, as one of the largest reservoirs in the state. I show this also because in the lower left-hand portion of the screen, that's the Oroville Reservoir. And it's an absolute critical reservoir for the State Water Project. More on that in a little bit. This is an initial boundary put together. The group that started the Lake Almanor Watershed Group focused on Lake Almanor because of its critical nature for Plumas County, Lassen County, in terms of the economy. It's a very substantial tourist economy there, terribly important in advancing socioeconomic health issues, employing people, and the like. This boundary, as you see to the north, runs up into Lassen Volcanic National Park. But in addition to this area around Lake Almanor, it also includes Upper Deer Creek, Upper Mill Creek, Upper Battle Creek, and these are some of the last of the free-running salmonid streams in the state of California, certainly inland. There's that barn again. This is 2007. That's the Moonlight Fire. Fortunately, the wind shifted, blew the fire back in the other direction. I'm going to talk about that slide in a moment. This was a year ago, the Walker Fire, and that smoked us out here for weeks and weeks. That's a remnant of the Walker Fire. Just as Will mentioned, these fires are so serious, and the Moonlight Fire, over 60% of that fire burned at high severity. And in that high severity area, shrubs, they occupied 3% prior to the burn. They are now a 10-fold increase. And researchers from the University of California, Davis, examining a bunch of large fires from 1999 to 2008, and including the Moonlight Fire, they reported that high severity fires destroy not only forests, but they lead to reduced plant diversity, animal diversity, and the like. We are not going to see forest in that area in my lifetime, and there's a good chance that we're going to see type conversion over time. So back to the area, I show you this because this is fire intervals or historic wildfire from 1900 to 1999. And you see a lot of yellow across the landscape. You see smaller patches. Look what happens over the last 20 years. These are fires that have been really, really damaging. Here's the Moonlight Fire area to the east of Lake Almanor, the reservoir. This, of course, is the Bear Fire, the North Complex Fire. This is the Paradise area, the Camp Fire that burned a couple years ago. We're seeing serious fires on top of serious and destructive fires. So again, just as Will pointed out, we are seeing larger fires, more destructive fires, and that's what we're trying to deal with. So my pointer is to this area to the north of the reservoir. And this speaks to what he also talked about is this fire return interval. And this area has one of the most significant departures of any area in the state. There hasn't been fire in some of this area for 120, 130 years, which means the density is extraordinarily high. We have to do things to deal with it. So who owns the land? Who are the partners? To the north, this area is the Park Service. Green, Lassen National Forest, Plumas National Forest down here. Sierra Pacific Industry, Collins Pine Company, lumber companies, and we have a lot of private ownerships all around here. But who really is involved in the South Lassen Watershed Group? It is certainly those owners, but we have over 25 groups, and I'm not going to name them here other than to just say, take a look at the diversity: green, federal and state agencies; white, local agencies; orange or environmental groups; and pinkish are industrial commercial groups. And the group spent months coming together. As Will pointed out, the focus is on where they can agree. We know that we can find areas of disagreement, but there is so much greater area of agreement in terms of the issues that the group and residents and industrial timber owners and the federal agencies are facing. I will just mention the goal of the group has been to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire and improve ecological resilience, watershed condition and function, local community health, and socioeconomic conditions. So the group had a boundary that they were working on. And let me just take you back about 4 years when the group that was focused on this Lake Almanor area said, we gotta go bigger. We really do need to deal with the upper tributaries and focus our efforts more. Did some strategic planning, and that was the launch of the South Lassen Watershed Group. But the group, in thinking about it as they came together, they said, but are these boundaries right? So the group started adding areas. This happens to be Collins Pine land. They're saying, let's include all of our land. Somebody looked at the Forest Service in the Lassen and said to the Almanor District, would it be more helpful if you include the entire district? And the Forest Service, to their credit and in the spirit of collaboration, said, yeah, it would be. So that was added as well. So the boundaries grew, and now the group is looking at, well, let's make sure that they make ecological sense. So as you see here on the east side and southeast side of the area, looking at trying to link this and make a more coherent boundary, tie it into ridge tops and so forth. So it's an ongoing work or effort in terms of identifying the boundaries. But so what are we doing? Here are some of the projects, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about all of them, but I do want to mention them briefly because they are important. What you see here, Rock Creek Project, I'll speak to. This is a meadow complex. This is actually noted it's in the Park Service area, and a lot of this is wilderness. They are the juniper, the fuels reduction and the Flatiron fuels reduction projects. Here's the Rock Creek Meadow Restoration and Forest Health. This is mostly on Collins Almanor Forest and using California Climate Investment funding. We're dealing with a lot of standing biomass here, but it is really a meadow restoration project. There's actually a creek running through here and taking out a number of trees to attempts to restore meadow habitat. So a lot of pine encroachment, and yeah, it was actually hit pretty heavy in terms of the thinning operation, but folks are really quite excited about the restoration of this meadow area. It's also in partnership with Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. They're conducting research on that project and how quickly it actually returns to meadow. Robbers Creek Mini, I'll say very little about it other than we're working very closely with Point Blue Conservation Science, taking a lead on this project with the Forest Service. This is all about meadow and aspen enhancement. And this is our Sawyer Crew. And they are hand sawing in wilderness to facilitate what Will talked a bunch about, this reintroduction of fire. We have such density and we have trees that are going to carry fire into the canopy, so they need to be thinned out, which is true for much of the landscape. We need to thin to put fire back in there. And in a wilderness area, there's no motorized anything, so they're using hand saws. And this group was an award-winning group, Partners of the Year for the National Park Service. last year, and their crew leader, Martha's an all-star and runs an outstanding crew. Did I ever think in all my years that the Sierra Institute would be hiring a Sawyer Crew, working with handsaws? Not a chance. Nor did I think that we'd be hiring a NEPA crew. We have specialists who are conducting NEPA analysis or environmental analysis on private and federal land, working very closely with the Lassen National Forest. This is the West Shore project, and what you can see here, again, this density, access, recreation access, critical, but talking about what's needed, how we bring players together. And what you see here, folks from the Forest Service, folks from the Meadow Summit Consortium, Sierra Institute, Sierra Pacific Industries, Plumas Fire Safe Council, among others, just at this field meeting.
Hey, Jonathan, this is Jennee. I just wanted to check in with a quick time check. If you could wrap up in 1 or 2 minutes to save some time for Q&A, that would be great.
I'm close.
Excellent, thank you.
So here we have Chairman Ben Cunningham, head of the Meadow. He's board chair of the Meadow Summit Consortium, as we're also talking with the Meadow Summit Consortium about integration of traditional ecological knowledge and its integration with Western forestry practices as they're out there doing stand exams. We talked about a diversity of ownership as well. And I shared with you a moment ago, there's the lake, there's the fire of 2012, which threatened many, many structures. And it basically shut down a third of the tourist season with the smoke that it produced in 2012. But I show this slide as much to say at a micro level, you see there's really a complexity of landscape ownership, and all of these folks are working together to advance this work. So where do we go from here after those projects? You see some of the projects outlined in this map. Those projects that we're actively working on now are about 10,000 acres, but on an 850,000 acre landscape, we've got to go bigger. What you see here, the purple cross hatching, is the West Lassen headwaters, 120 to 150,000 acres that we are now starting to analyze to do project work in that area. It's a longer term effort, but it is truly the scale that we have to go to if we're going to make a difference in this landscape in the near term. That is going to scale. Last couple slides here. So from the big picture, this area is critical. 25 million Californians depend on this watershed. 750,000 acres of farmland also rely on water coming out of this area. Those arrows coming out of that watershed are drawn to scale. That's where the water goes in this state. Here's Lake Almanor again. It also produces 10 to 12% of the state's hydropower, the stairway of power. So there are multiple benefits, and it goes way beyond locals, and it does matter what we do with this area. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks very much for having me a part of the panel. I appreciate it and look forward to questions.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, and to all of our speakers. We only have a few minutes left for Q&A, but we should be able to get a few questions in there, and a lot of really great questions coming in from the audience. So I'll get through as many of them as we can. The first one I want to throw out there for Will is how the public perception has changed recently on prescribed fire, specifically around potential smoke versus wildfire smoke. Are there still a lot of misperceptions around prescribed fires and or NIMBYism?
Well, I think we have to take responsibility for changing those perceptions in our local communities, you know, because really it is up to the people that live in a place to shift how we see fire landscape. You know, one example is when we started planning for this last fall 2020 prescribed fire training exchange, we were told by our state and federal partners that they didn't think our communities were ready for fire and prescribed fire smoke after such an extreme wildfire season. So what I did was I went to the wildfire public meetings that were still ongoing, and when we got to the Q&A section for the crowd to ask the presenters, the agencies, questions about the fire, I turned to the community and said, hey, how do you feel about us doing prescribed fire this fall around our community to prevent impacts from the next wildfire? And overwhelmingly, in both cases, the communities showed their support through a raising of hands and supportive comments. And so all the agencies who were there to talk to the community were able to see, in fact, how much community support there was. So, you know, it's a gradient across the state, but engage your community and start to talk about the pros and cons, because the reality is people understand now the clear and present threat of wildfire and are willing to accept the small scale smoke impacts that we create through prescribed fire.
Thanks very much, Will. And a quick question for Patrick. Now that the Forest Management Task Force has created the Wildfire Resiliency Plan, what will the makeup and goals of the task force be in the future?
Good question. I'm in the process right now with working with the governor's office and Secretary Wade to restructure the task force. The current proposal right now is to shift it from being a state-led task force to a joint state, federal, local, and tribally led task force, with the idea that we'd have quarterly meetings and we would receive updates quarterly from the work groups and lead agencies. We've mapped out all 100 task force actions. All of them are going to be assigned to lead agencies and lead work groups, and they will report their progress up to this, publicly scheduled task force to make sure we're on track and on schedule, so it doesn't become yet another interesting report that sits on a shelf, but is really, action oriented and something that we intend to deliver on. Good question.
Thanks. And the next question, I think, will be good for all of the speakers to touch on. What exactly are the impediments to state agencies partnering more broadly with other entities on fire? And Patrick, maybe we can start with you.
Well, I mean, I can say briefly, I think Will went through some of the impediments. I mean, you've got a combination of agency cultures, funding, liability issues, community acceptance. And so I think we're steadily trying to work through each of those right now. But there's no substitute for buy-in at the local level. I mean, that was his answer, and I completely agree with it. Our job at the state level is to try to give these local efforts the sustained funding they need to succeed, and rely on them to try to deal with these efforts, while recognizing that unless we integrate funding, integrate permitting, streamline permitting, we're not going to get there as quickly as we need to.
Thanks. Do any of the other speakers want to chime in before we move on to the next question?
I'll just add a quick response and say, and Patrick alluded to it, it's timing. It just takes so long at times to work through folks. Now, having said that, we've come in an extraordinarily long way with the Lassen National Forest, for example. So there is an example of an agency culture that is changing as we are working with it. Last comment on that is recognition that local knowledge, local collaborative perspectives actually are pretty darn good. It is not just the latest model, but it is integrating local knowledge into some of the other modeling efforts.
Thanks. And I'll throw one last question out there. We only have 1 minute left, and I'll change it to say, so what are the greatest challenges to implementing actions associated with adapting communities to be less susceptible to wildfire damage? And I'll ask each of the speakers to just say, if you had to pick a top challenge to implementing those actions, what would it be?
This is Will. I would say, how we deal with liability around fire in California is really a key issue. And right now, all the cards are stacked against prescribed fire and for wildfire. There's virtually no liability for actions taken in the wildfire environment, even though they have catastrophic effects. Whereas, as a practitioner of prescribed fire, we have to do environmental compliance. We're responsible for our smoke. We have to have all the training and qualifications. And so I think, we really need to wrestle with that, because wildfires aren't an act of God. We created these wildfires and we need to deal with it.
I'll only add a lot of this conversation has been focused on reintroduction of fire. To do that in some areas requires considerable thinning, and it involves biomass utilization. There is a sense among many that that shouldn't be done. It can't be done in an ecologically sound manner. And in fact, it really can be. And that also is one of the values of diverse collaborative groups, saying we need outcomes that really do respect and respond to all the needs and the diversity of habitat and so forth. So recognizing that mechanical treatments and other biomass activities must take place, and simultaneously investing in the technology to utilize that material, or we as a state will not succeed.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Micah, can you also address whether the slides might be made available? There are a couple folks who are.
We'll be making the slides available. We'll be making the presentation with our little tech glitches edited out of it available. Thanks for rolling with those speakers. Tremendous amount of information in a short period of time. Thank you so much, Jennee, for fantastic moderation. We'll be back next week, same bat time, same bat channel, to talk about more of what's going on around the state on these issues. And just wanted to thank Greg Norton, the former CEO of RCRC, Glenda Humiston at UCANR, Steve Frisch at the Sierra Business Council, Bill Tripp from the Carrick Tribe, and everybody else who's been leading our work in forest resiliency through the California Economic Summit over the years to tee up this kind of material. And thank you again to the HEWLETT Foundation for your support of these projects. Please register for this and other webinars, and we will see you next Thursday.